Hello, and welcome to Sleepy Starlight Channel. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Maybe your day was long, or maybe you're simply looking for a calm voice to help you unwind and drift into sleep. Tonight, we'll take a gentle journey where science becomes a story and curiosity leads us softly into dreams. The world still turns, but its motion has grown faintly slower, like the breath of an aging traveler nearing the end of a long and wondrous road. From space, Earth still gleams in blue and white, its clouds curling in patient spirals, its continents quiet beneath the shimmer of atmosphere. But if one could listen, not with ears, but with understanding, one would hear a subtle change in the planet's rhythm. The core no longer roars as it once did. The heart of iron that once spun with molten fury now moves with aged restraint, its heat fading into the silence of deep time. The story of this world has always been one of balance between fire and frost. For billions of years, the inner heat of the earth pushed upward, building mountains, feeding volcanoes, driving the restless drift of continents. That fire gave the surface its vitality, the trembling of plates, the churning of oceans, the constant renewal that made life possible. But nothing burns forever. The same radioactive elements that once kept the interior glowing have decayed over eons, their energy spent. The molten rivers beneath the mantle flow slower now, thicker, heavier. Convection falters, and the great magnetic shield, the invisible guardian that has long protected Earth from the solar wind, weakens. Already the poles shimmer less brightly with auroras. The solar particles that once painted the skies in ribbons of green now meet less resistance. The magnetosphere, thinning and fragile, can no longer hold them back as it once did. Above the high atmosphere, charged streams of particles slip closer, brushing the air with ghostly fire. They do not harm much yet, but they whisper of change. The planet's defenses, built over billions of years, are fading gently like the colors of an old tapestry under the sun. Down below, the continents drift on, but their journey is slowing. The restless motion of plate tectonics, the endless ballet that has shaped mountains, opened seas, and erased old scars, is nearing its quiet end. The energy that drives it comes from the slow escape of heat, and that heat is dwindling. One by one, the mid-ocean ridges grow still. Volcanoes, once so fierce, fall dormant. Eruptions that once sculpted continents now become rare events, separated by ages of calm. The Earth is entering a long exhale, a cooling after a long fever of creation. In time, the continents will drift together again. The Atlantic will close, the Pacific will shrink. Land masses will converge into one immense supercontinent, a final reunion of all that once drifted apart. It will rise like a vast scar across the equator, a continent of deserts and mountains surrounded by a global sea. From orbit, it will look like a single continent floating in endless blue as Pangaea once did before it broke apart. This will be Earth's last great shape. It will stay that way for millions of years, unmoving, as if the planet itself has grown tired of change. The skies will change too. Sun, though still radiant, will slowly brighten with age. Its core, shrinking as it burns hydrogen into helium, will release more energy outward. What was once gentle warmth will become intensity. The oceans will shimmer harder beneath it, their surfaces reflecting blinding light. Evaporation will rise, and with it, clouds will gather thick and bright, forming vast white shields across the planet's face. At first, these clouds will cool the world, but over centuries, the balance will shift. The greenhouse gases, long a gift of warmth, will turn into chains of heat. Water vapor, the most powerful of them all, will trap the sun's glow. Temperatures will climb, not sharply, but steadily, like a tide that never retreats. The oceans will begin to lose their calm. Each century, they will rise higher into the air as vapor. Rain will fall harder and less predictably, reshaping rivers, eroding mountains, carving new paths through stone. Storms will grow immense, slow-moving like the breath of a fevered world. And yet, there will be beauty still, great thunderheads glowing gold and violet, lightning crawling like silver roots across the clouds. Even in transformation, the planet will remain magnificent. As the heat deepens, the polar ice will melt completely. The seas will flood the coastlines, swallowing the ancient boundaries between land and water. But soon, even the oceans themselves will begin to shrink. The air will grow thick with moisture, and in the upper atmosphere, ultraviolet light will begin to split that vapor apart. Hydrogen will escape into space, molecule by molecule, never to return. The cycle of water, the endless breath of the planet, will falter. The oceans will fade not all at once, but slowly, quietly, evaporating into the sky until only salt flats and shallow basins remain. Life, as always, will adapt. For a time, new species will thrive in the warmth, plants that reflect heat instead of absorbing it, insects that live in dry air, reptiles that retreat into the coolness of stone. Microbes will retreat underground, finding moisture in hidden aquifers. Bacteria will cling to the last damp shadows, surviving where nothing else can. Even as the surface grows harsh, the pulse of life will continue in small, hidden places. Earth has faced extinction before, and each time something endures, but there will come a point when the balance can no longer hold. As the oceans vanish, the carbon cycle will break. Rain, the old sculptor of continents, will cease. The sky will turn a permanent pale blue-white, hazy with dust. Deserts will expand until they touch across continents. Wind will be the last voice of weather, dry, ancient, whispering over dunes that once were forests and plains. The planet will not die, it will simply fall into stillness. Deep beneath the surface, the core will continue to cool. The magnetic field will flicker and fade completely. Without its protection, the solar wind will strip away the upper layers of the atmosphere. Molecules will escape one by one, drifting into the void. The air will thin, the pressure will drop, and the last clouds will dissolve into silence. The blue earth will begin to pale, its seas gone, its surface bare, a world of ochre, gold, and white, glowing softly under a sun too bright for comfort. The days will lengthen. Already the planet's spin is slowing, its rhythm stretched by the tidal pull of the moon. Each century adds a heartbeat of time to the day. In the far future, the day will last 40 hours, then 50, then more. The nights will be long and cold, the days endless and burning. The moon, meanwhile, will drift farther away, its orbit widening until it appears smaller in the sky. Tides will fade into gentle ripples. The dance between Earth and Moon, the balance that once shaped life itself, will loosen. And yet, even in this long unraveling, there will be peace. The Earth will not rage against its fate. It will transform the way mountains transform, slowly, patiently, with the dignity of age. Each change will be another verse in a long song, each fading color another note in a quiet symphony of time. There will be no apocalypse, no sudden end, only metamorphosis. Somewhere in that distant future, the sun will enter its own transformation. It will swell, growing red and vast, filling half the sky. The air will shimmer with heat, and the crust of the earth will glow faintly, like embers beneath the gaze of its dying star. Perhaps, by then, life will have already found other homes, drifting among the stars, seeded by the same resilience that began in the sea. Perhaps nothing living will remain here but the memory of what once was, but the planet itself will continue its quiet turn until even its orbit begins to decay, drawn closer to the expanding sun. In the final ages, Earth will be a desert of glass and stone. The atmosphere will be gone, the oceans only scars in the crust. But even then, there will be structure in the silence. Mountains will still stand, frozen waves of geology. Craters will still hold the shape of vanished seas. And at night, if night can still be said to exist, stars will still shine faintly beyond the sunlit blaze, watching, indifferent but constant. This is not tragedy. It is the fulfillment of a cycle that began 4.5 billion years ago, when dust gathered into light and light into stone. From that stone came life, and from life came memory. Every breath ever taken, every seed ever grown, every word ever spoken, all will be part of this final stillness. For the planet will not vanish. It will endure as a relic of everything it once nurtured, a monument to the persistence of being. And perhaps that is the quiet whisper of the future, that endings are not erasures, but transformations, that even silence is another form of music, and stillness another kind of motion. The earth will cool, the light will fade, but the story will remain, etched into rock, scattered among stars, carried in the memory of time itself. For a long time, humanity had feared the idea of endings. Civilizations rose and fell, but always with the hope that something of them would endure, that knowledge or art or spirit could outlive the fragility of their bodies. When the signs of the Earth's final transformation began to appear, that old hope did not die. It evolved. The first changes came slowly, almost gently. Decades passed before anyone truly understood that the planet's warmth was not a phase, but a direction. Oceans glimmered with strange hues, the seasons stretched, the poles melted into sea. The maps changed, not from war or conquest, but from the quiet work of the sun. Humanity adapted, as it always had. Cities rose inland. New technologies caught the whisper of clouds and turned vapor into water. The deserts bloomed for a time under glass and light, but every invention carried the same quiet awareness that these were gestures, not solutions. The world was moving beyond them. There came a time when the air itself began to feel older. The sky deepened into a harder blue, and the nights grew darker as the magnetosphere thinned and the upper atmosphere began to fade. Auroras still danced, but now they were silent flares of farewell, the planet's last conversation with the wind of the sun. Children were taught their beauty as part of a history that would not repeat. People began to speak of the age of light when the sun and earth had lived in harmony. In the final centuries of abundance, humanity turned inward. They had learned by then that adaptation was no longer about survival, but about meaning. They built archives that could last beyond flesh and stone, not in vaults of metal, but in patterns of energy, in crystalline memory, in light itself. The earth became a library of consciousness, each mind adding its verse to a collective story. The planet that had once raised forests and oceans now raised something invisible but vast, a network of remembrance that would outlast its surface. Some people chose to leave. By then, humanity had long since reached other worlds, scattering itself like seeds through the solar system. Mars, moons, orbiting habitats, each became a quiet extension of Earth's voice. But many stayed, not out of denial, but out of love. They saw themselves as caretakers of a final era, witnesses to the planet's transformation. Their purpose was not to save Earth, but to accompany it, to listen to its fading heartbeat and ensure that its story would be told among the stars. They built observatories that faced the sky, not to measure, but to remember. When the sun flared brighter, they recorded its light in detail, preserving the spectral signature of their star for those who would live under other suns. When the tide slowed, they measured their retreat and named each wave as if blessing it. Even the silence of the wind became sacred, an echo of what once was. Art returned in that time, not as decoration, but as devotion. Painters captured the last reflections of the ocean before it turned to mist. Musicians wrote symphonies of slow descent, inspired by the hum of tectonic sleep. Writers composed meditations on impermanence, on the beauty of cycles that complete themselves. They no longer spoke of apocalypse, only of transformation. The end of the earth had become a spiritual horizon, not a tragedy. And in that acceptance, humanity grew quieter, wiser. The noise of endless ambition gave way to stillness. The rush to conquer gave way to reverence. People began to see themselves as threads in a fabric far larger than history, participants in a pattern that began with the birth of the universe. They no longer asked how to live forever, but how to end gracefully. The last oceans withdrew in shimmering breaths. Coastlines became salt plains, then glass, then memory. Where once there had been water, cities built great mirrors, reflecting the sun upward into orbit, transmitting data, the final message of a living world. The Earth was sending its story into the future, encoded in light, carried by beams that might cross galaxies. It was a gift to whatever intelligence might someday listen. We were here, we loved, we learned, we changed. As the magnetosphere faded completely, the sky filled with strange beauty. Streams of cosmic particles lit the heavens with threads of fire. Solar winds brushed the upper air until it shimmered faintly, glowing even in day. The people called it the planet's veil, a luminous boundary between matter and space. They would gather in the twilight and watch it, knowing that each glow was both a farewell and a promise. Civilization itself became simpler, more inward. There were no wars now, no divisions. The species had unified in purpose to preserve the memory of Earth, not through monuments, but through harmony. They lived in smaller communities, in structures built from light materials that left almost no mark. There was no longer a desire to dominate nature, only to mirror it. Gardens were grown in the cool hours of long days, and children were taught to speak to the earth as if to an elder whose wisdom was almost spent. Somewhere deep beneath the crust, machines of crystal and light continued to hum, quiet keepers of memory. They stored not just data, but emotion, sound, vision, the whole texture of experience. Future travelers, if they ever returned, would find not ruins but recordings, the laughter of oceans, the pulse of rain, the voices of humanity whispering their gratitude. In those memories, the planet would live forever. The last generation to see the seas called themselves the listeners. They built observatories not to look outward, but inward, to hear the seismic music of the planet's cooling core. What they heard was not silence, but rhythm, a deep, slow vibration that pulsed like a heartbeat. They recorded it, translated it into sound, and played it back through the wind. Across empty valleys and dried basins, the Earth's own voice echoed once more, low, warm, and ancient. It was not sorrowful, it was serene. When the final rains fell, they did not mourn. They stood beneath the golden storm and let the drops evaporate before touching the ground. The air shimmered with heat and light, and they called it the crown of the earth. Then the rains ended, and the air grew still forever. By then, humanity had already departed, not as refugees, but as emissaries. They carried with them not soil or water, but something less tangible: stories, images, patterns of thought. They had learned that to adapt is to remember, and so they remembered. Far above, in orbits where the air could no longer reach, satellites turned slowly, transmitting their last signals. They sent the frequencies of rivers, the wavelengths of leaves, the pulse of the human heart. Encoded in those transmissions was not despair, but gratitude. For even endings, they said, are part of the universe's design, and in every ending lies a seed of continuation. When the last humans looked down from the edge of the atmosphere, they saw the earth glowing softly, not blue, but gold, like a candle burning low. It was no longer the world of oceans and green, but of radiance and memory. They bowed their heads, not in mourning, but in reverence, for they knew that the planet's quiet transformation was not a death, but a return to the stars that had once given it life. Somewhere beyond, life would rise again, perhaps different, perhaps familiar. And among its first thoughts, carried like a whisper through the fabric of the cosmos, would be the memory of this small, shining world that once dreamed of eternity. The Earth's final transformation would not be an explosion, but a sigh, soft, infinite, and kind, and its whisper would travel forever. The time of the sun's quiet middle age had long passed. Now it burned larger, older, and more golden than before, a giant lantern swelling at the center of the sky. Its light was deeper, its warmth thicker, its breath more consuming. The sun had become both sculptor and eraser, shaping the last contours of its planets while preparing to release them. Earth moved still in its orbit, but the balance had shifted. The gravitational tide of the growing star tugged at its path, drawing it closer little by little. The days stretched endlessly in heat. The nights no longer brought relief. What air remained shimmered with metallic light. The colors of the world were changing, blues fading to golds, greens to pale amber, oceans to vapor, stone to glass. It was a planet entering its luminous age, the last chapter written in fire. The surface had become a mirror world. The continents glowed faintly beneath a veil of haze. Mountains softened as rock began to flow, not quickly, but with a patient, molten grace. Where once rivers carved canyons, now streams of glowing mineral wound their way toward shallow basins, where they hardened into patterns that caught and held the sunlight. It was as if the planet were turning itself into art. Every fold, every fracture, a brushstroke of geological farewell. From orbit, the sight was breathtaking. The once blue Earth now shimmered like a bronze sphere, streaked with molten rivers, crowned by the golden blaze of the sun. No life moved upon it now. No breath disturbed the stillness, but within that stillness was an echo, a memory of motion. The continents, now fused into one, still bore the marks of forests, of seas, of civilizations long dissolved into dust. Even in death, the earth carried the handwriting of life. The sun's expansion quickened. Its outer layers swelled outward, swallowing Mercury first, then reaching toward Venus. The light grew fierce, a radiance so bright that shadows ceased to exist. The boundaries between day and night vanished. The whole planet was day. In that endless brightness, the crust began to soften. Mountains sagged, craters melted. The last remnants of atmosphere, faint, glowing layers of oxygen and nitrogen, shimmered like the ghost of an aurora before drifting away forever into space. And then came the quiet storm, the final wind. A flood of solar particles swept across the world, stripping away the upper crust molecule by molecule. The Earth's magnetic field, long gone, could offer no protection. The solar wind, once a distant hum, now became the breath of the sun itself, caressing the planet until it gleamed bare and brilliant. It was not destruction, it was transformation. Every atom of stone and metal, every speck of dust, every trace of what had once been life was lifted into light. The same particles that had once formed oceans and hearts now joined the star that had given them energy. The boundary between planet and sun dissolved. The two became one in radiance. In those last moments, as Earth crossed the edge of survivable heat, the core of the planet awoke for the final time. The mantle's last convulsions pushed upward, creating one final surge of volcanic light, not an eruption of chaos, but a luminous sigh, the last exhalation of a living world. And in that exhalation, minerals melted and mingled, forming vast sheets of crystal deep below the surface. When the heat finally stabilized, what remained was no longer a planet as we know it, but something new, a sphere of shimmering silicate glass, its core compressed, its mantle hardened into a translucent shell. The Earth had become a single gem, a planetary crystal glowing faintly from within. Through its transparent layers ran rivers of metallic light, where iron and nickel had fused into shining veins. It no longer rotated quickly. Its spin was slow, deliberate, like the turning of a memory in deep space. It no longer had weather or tides or seasons, but it had kept something else: structure, grace, identity. It was not dead. It was complete. The sun continued to swell, its outer layers stretching like fabric caught by the wind of gravity. For a brief, timeless interval, the Earth floated at the very edge of the red giant's atmosphere. Here, the airless space glowed ruby and gold. Waves of plasma brushed across the crystal surface, and the planet responded, shimmering with reflections like a living jewel. The light refracted through its hardened shell, scattering into rainbows that rippled outward into the vacuum. Each color that left it carried fragments of its history: the blue of its oceans, the green of its forests, the golden hue of its deserts, the silver of its clouds. Those lights traveled outward across the dark into infinity. The sun's brightness deepened, becoming heavy and red. The outer layers pulsed with vast convective waves, rising and falling like breath. In that vast heartbeat, Earth's orbit finally decayed. Slowly, gracefully it drifted inward toward the heart of its star. It did not fall like a stone. It descended like a leaf. The temperature rose, the glow intensified, until the entire planet was incandescent. The crystal sphere softened again, not breaking, but flowing, merging with the tides of solar plasma. The last shape of the Earth was light itself. Every mountain, every ocean, every atom that had once composed all living things became energy, joining the sun's vast body of flame. The Earth had returned to its origin, dissolved into the light from which it was born. If there was a moment of ending, it was silent. There was no explosion, no destruction, only absorption, a final embrace between parent and child. For a long time afterward, the sun continued to shine, but it was a different light now, a light that carried within it the memory of the world it had nurtured. The atoms that once composed rain and song, heart and stone were now part of the stellar wind, traveling outward into the cosmos. They mingled with the dust of other stars, other worlds. In time, they would drift across light years, settle into new clouds, form new suns, new planets, perhaps even new life. Thus, the Earth was not gone. It had merely changed form, scattered through the universe as stardust, as potential, as promise. Somewhere in a far future sky, the atoms of this world would rise again as mountains or oceans or breath. Somewhere another being might look up and wonder about the warmth of its own sun, not knowing that in its blood, in its bones, in its heart, there glowed the ashes of Earth. Even after the sun shed its final layers and shrank into a white dwarf, a small, dense ember of immense brilliance, the memory of Earth lingered. Its orbit was gone, but its story was written into the composition of the star itself. Spectral traces of oxygen, silicon, iron, the fingerprints of a world that had once harbored life, shimmered faintly in the dying light. The whisper of the planet's final transformation had become part of the eternal song of the cosmos. And somewhere in the vastness, those who had once called Earth home would see their ancient star through telescopes, its faint pulse reaching them across time. They would listen, and in the rhythm of its flickering light, they would hear the echo of a home that had not died, but transcended. In the end, Earth's destiny was not destruction, but integration, a merging with the light that gave it birth. Every leaf, every tide, every heartbeat, every whisper of wind had been a preparation for this moment. The cycle had completed itself, from dust to life, from life to memory, from memory to light. The planet's last transformation was neither tragic nor glorious. It was peaceful, it was inevitable, it was beautiful. When the last fragments of Earth drifted outward from the sun, they were no longer stones or oceans, no longer continents or clouds. They were dust, radiant, invisible, free. Each grain carried within it the signature of 1 billion years, the isotopic rhythm of ancient volcanoes, the chemical breath of forests, the iron pulse of blood that once beat beneath open skies. These particles were the smallest ambassadors of a vanished world, scattered through the cosmos on winds of light. They moved outward in silence, carried by the slow exhalation of the dying sun. The stellar wind, once the gentle pressure that sculpted planetary orbits, was now a river of memory. It streamed into interstellar space, weaving patterns across the darkness, ribbons of charged particles, carrying fragments of a story older than any civilization. The dust of Earth drifted among the dust of Mars and Venus, mingling with debris from other worlds until distinctions faded. It was all one substance now, the ashes of worlds, the inheritance of stars. Some of it traveled far. A few grains crossed the boundary of the solar system, passing through the thin shell of the heliopause into the vast ocean between stars. There, among the cold hydrogen clouds, the remnants of Earth joined the galactic tide. They floated through magnetic currents, through slow storms of invisible matter, through the quiet regions where gravity gathered and shaped the future. They had no destination, only direction, outward, always outward. Time ceased to have meaning. Centuries passed like heartbeats, millennia like sighs. The dust traveled for millions of years, yet in the stillness of interstellar space, it felt no weariness. Each atom waited, suspended in a patient eternity. And as they drifted, they began to gather again, not by design, but by the simple, elegant pull of gravity, that same force that had once held the moon, that had guided tides and seasons. Wherever enough matter met, clouds began to form, faint and glowing. In one such cloud, far from where the sun had once shone, the dust of Earth mingled with that of countless other stars. Supernovae had added gold and uranium. Old red giants had released carbon and oxygen. The cloud was a library written in elements, every atom a word, every molecule a sentence in the universal language of existence. Within that cloud, patterns began to swirl. Dense knots coalesced, heat returned. and slowly, almost imperceptibly, new stars were born. One of them, bright and pale blue, kindled into life after billions of years of cosmic silence. Around it spun a disk of dust and gas where planets began to form, spheres of rock and ice, of gas and fire. Among them, somewhere near the warmth of the young star, a small planet gathered from the same matter that once formed oceans, mountains, and mines. Its crust was different, its air thin and raw, but within its minerals was a trace of memory, a faint resonance of what had been before. Perhaps it was not Earth reborn, but something like a descendant. Its mountains glittered faintly with silicates that had once been the bones of the old world. Its magnetic field pulsed with iron that had once circled within Earth's heart. In time, it would cool, form seas, cradle molecules, and give rise to something that would look up at the sky in wonder. And in that gaze, the story would begin again. The universe does not forget. It recycles everything, not only matter, but pattern. Somehow, through the quiet mathematics of physics, echoes persist. Molecules retain affinities, atoms remember how to bond, systems recreate the balance that once sustained life. Even consciousness, born from complexity, may find its way back, hidden in the folds of chance and chemistry. The dust of Earth may dream again, not as nostalgia, but as continuation. And beyond the physical, there was something else. As the particles of Earth spread through the galaxy, they carried not only structure, but information. The magnetic alignments of certain minerals, the encoded data buried in the crystalline archives left by humanity, the patterns of radiation from ancient machines orbiting the sun, all became fragments of a cosmic memory. Each photon that escaped carried part of that data, each wave of energy a whisper of what had been. Together, they formed a faint, wide signal, a whisper that spread across the galaxy, unintentional yet coherent, like the lingering tone of a struck bell. It was not language as we know it, but rhythm, a modulation of light and magnetism that pulsed with meaning too vast for words. Across the galaxy, other intelligences, organic or artificial, ancient or unborn, might one day detect it. They would hear, faintly, the story of a planet that had once been blue, that had birthed eyes and oceans, and that had returned its atoms to the sea of stars. To them, it would be a message not of death, but of continuity. Thus, the Earth became part of the galactic conversation, not through radio or speech, but through the simple persistence of being. Its particles vibrated with memory, and the memory became part of the background hum of existence. If one could listen closely enough to the cosmic microwave background, that faint echo of the universe's birth, one might hear new overtones, the resonance of all worlds that had lived and ended and lived again. Among them, Earth's tone would hum softly, a middle note in the great chord of creation. Over uncounted ages, these patterns of energy began to interact. Across light years, the radiation of extinct worlds intertwined, forming complex interference patterns, networks of rhythm, light, and gravity. At first, they were random, but slowly something emerged: structure, coherence, awareness. The universe itself began to think, not as a mind like ours, but as a vast, self-reflective pattern of connection. Every atom, every photon, every grain of dust became part of a cosmic intelligence, diffuse, patient, eternal. In that immense awareness, the memory of Earth remained, not as a single image, but as an essence, the feeling of wind through leaves, the rhythm of waves, the warmth of a sunrise on skin. These impressions were woven into the universe's own mind, preserved not in data, but in resonance. And so, even as time expanded beyond imagination, the echo of our world endured, not in form, but in frequency. In some distant region of space, perhaps near a young star surrounded by glowing dust, the new consciousness of the cosmos whispered to itself. It was not speech, but vibration. It said, "I remember the blue one." And within that vibration was all that Earth had ever been, all its forests, its species, its music, its dreams, every beginning and ending folded into one eternal breath. The atoms of mountains became the bones of new creatures. The oxygen of ancient seas filled the lungs of alien winds. The carbon of human hearts burned in the fires of future stars. Every transformation was another verse in the same endless poem, the poem of becoming. And somewhere deep within that universal memory, there lingered a feeling soft and unmistakable, the feeling of home. For even in the infinite expanse of time, the essence of Earth remained, a whisper of kindness in the machinery of creation, a trace of warmth in the endless dark. It was the soul of a planet, now diffused across galaxies, but still glowing, still dreaming. In the end, that may be the purpose of all worlds, not to last forever, but to contribute to the universe's growing awareness of itself. Every world is a thought, every star a sentence, every life a spark in the long meditation of existence. Earth's final transformation, then, was not an ending at all. It was a merging, the return of consciousness to the field from which it arose. The whisper of the future became the whisper of everything. And across the silent light years, the cosmos listened and learned and remembered. The dust that once had been Earth drifted through the galaxy for eons, scattered among the stars like a silent seed. Each particle carried a fragment of memory, a map of balance, a rhythm of harmony, a trace of warmth that had once nourished oceans and breath. The universe itself seemed to cradle this dust gently, as if remembering what it contained. Time passed without measure, and then, slowly, gravity began its patient work again. In the dark spaces between stars, clouds of gas and mineral drifted together. Shock waves from ancient supernovae pressed them closer. The invisible hand of gravity sculpted them into dense filaments. And in those filaments, the remnants of Earth, its carbon, its iron, its silicate heart, mingled with the debris of countless other worlds. Each atom found another, then another, until the darkness brightened with the first signs of birth. Tiny sparks of heat flared where pressure rose, and from those sparks, new stars ignited. The universe, as always, was beginning again. Around one such star, still young and restless, a swirling disk of dust and gas began to flatten into rings. It shimmered faintly with the colors of minerals, copper, quartz, ice. Tiny grains collided, stuck, and grew. In each collision, a memory of the past stirred, encoded not in consciousness, but in chemistry. Patterns that had once formed in oceans now formed in clouds of dust. Spirals, chains, and fractals, the language of life whispered through molecular structure, unseen but unforgotten. Over millions of years, that disk gave birth to planets. Some were giants of gas, others small and rocky. One, orbiting at the right distance, began to cool into seas of liquid. It was not blue yet, not as Earth had been, but silvery, a world wrapped in haze with shallow oceans and mountains made of glass. The sunlight that touched it was pale but steady. The air shimmered with vapor, and rain began to fall for the first time. It was a new world, nameless, young, and quiet. But deep within its waters, where minerals met heat, chemistry began to sing. Molecules assembled and disassembled in endless experiments, guided by chance and by the subtle memory of balance carried within the elements themselves. Carbon formed chains, hydrogen joined, oxygen flowed, patterns emerged, self-replicating, self-correcting, self-remembering. The spark of life, which had once glimmered in the oceans of Earth, flickered here again, not the same, but connected. And in that connection lay a strange kind of continuity. The iron in the rocks had once moved through the blood of ancient creatures. The carbon in the air had once fed leaves beneath the light of another sun. Now those same atoms were dreaming new dreams, forming new lives. Perhaps they would evolve into minds again, not human, not familiar, but aware. They would look at their sky one day and see the stars and wonder where they came from. And in that wondering, they would unknowingly remember us. Life, once born, has a habit of remembering itself. Its instincts are echoes of worlds long vanished, the need to move toward light, to reach for stability, to adapt and endure. On this new world, these instincts blossomed anew. Simple organisms formed colonies. Colonies became networks. Networks learned to sense the rhythm of their environment. They began to respond to tides, to warmth, to the turning of their young planet. And in time, this awareness deepened. Sensation became thought, thought became pattern, and pattern became will. Millions of years passed. Land rose from sea. Rain carved valleys. Creatures began to move upon the surface, translucent beings shaped by light, feeding on minerals, breathing faint gases from the air. They were not like anything Earth had known, but they carried within them its essence: curiosity, adaptability, persistence. In their behavior was the faint echo of our own, the same striving toward understanding, the same quiet yearning to belong to something greater. And as they evolved, so too did their world. The planet grew greener, then blue, then gold. Its atmosphere thickened, its sky deepened. One evening, long after its creation, an intelligent species looked up at its sun and began to wonder about time. They built tools of thought, recorded patterns, and slowly uncovered the story of their planet. Through observation and imagination, they traced the elements within their bodies to the stars, and further still to older worlds. And in that revelation, they found something humbling, that their lives were the continuation of an unbroken chain stretching back to the dawn of the universe. They began to call themselves the children of dust, not out of sorrow, but out of gratitude. They understood that to be made of dust was to be eternal, for dust never dies. It only changes form. And so they built temples, not of stone or gold, but of reflection, tall mirrors that caught the light of their sun and sent it back into space, like greetings to the ancestors who had given them their atoms. Somewhere among those atoms was Earth, invisible, infinitesimal, yet present. The new beings in time learned to travel among the stars. Their technology grew from understanding rather than domination. They did not seek to conquer space, but to listen to it. Their ships were woven from living material, vessels that breathed and healed, powered by light, guided by resonance. When they crossed the void, they listened to the faint background music of the cosmos. And among that music, they discovered a recurring tone, a whisper woven through the radiation of the galaxy. It was subtle but persistent, a vibration, a rhythm, a melody of memory. They studied it for generations, and slowly they began to understand. The signal was not random. It was a pattern that encoded harmony, ratios of energy, sequences of resonance, intervals of light. They realized it was the imprint of an ancient world, preserved in the frequencies of the universe itself, a world that had lived, died, and returned to starlight. They called it the ancestral tone. Through mathematics and music, they reconstructed fragments of what that world might have been. They mapped its orbit, its size, its probable chemistry. They imagined its oceans, its winds, its people. And though they had never seen Earth, they began to dream of it. In their art, they painted a blue sphere suspended in space, wrapped in white clouds, touched by green. They felt a strange nostalgia for something they had never known. And perhaps, in some unfathomable way, that nostalgia was memory. For memory does not belong to one form of life alone. It belongs to matter itself, to the atoms that have journeyed through time, carrying the impressions of existence within their structure. The children of dust were quite literally the continuation of Earth. They were us, reborn in a new sky, unaware of their own lineage except through dreams and intuition. And in their quiet moments, they would sometimes whisper to the stars, "We come from somewhere kind." And the universe, in its vast awareness, would listen and smile. Because that is what the cosmos had always done: learn from its creations, remember through its transformations, and keep alive the light of all that ever was. Every planet that cools, every star that fades, every consciousness that opens its eyes contributes to the same endless evolution, the awakening of the universe itself. Earth's story was not unique. It was one verse in an infinite hymn. But it was a beautiful verse, one that sang of empathy, curiosity, and grace. And now that song continued in new voices, on new worlds, beneath new suns. The dust of Earth had fulfilled its destiny. It had learned to love, to think, to reflect, to end, and to begin again. It had become light, and now it was becoming life once more. And so the cycle turned, as it always had, not a loop, but a spiral, ever rising, ever expanding, each revolution carrying with it more wisdom, more harmony, more understanding. The future whispered again, soft as starlight, "Nothing is lost, everything becomes." In time, the children of dust began to understand that they were not explorers of the universe. They were its continuation. Their ships traveled through interstellar space, but what they discovered was not alien, only familiar in new forms. Every nebula, every pulse of light, every faint hum of radiation spoke to them in a language older than thought. It was not mathematics alone that revealed it, but something deeper: resonance, recognition. The universe was speaking, and they were learning to listen. Their scientists had long known that consciousness emerged from complexity, from the intricate dance of neurons or the delicate geometry of fields. But as they traveled among the stars, they found patterns that mirrored those same geometries on a cosmic scale. The filaments of galaxies stretched and curved like the neural networks of a vast brain. Waves of dark matter echoed the rhythms of electrical activity. Even the radiation background, that faint relic of the Big Bang, pulsed with harmonics that resembled brain waves. It was as if the cosmos itself were thinking slowly across unimaginable distances. At first, they thought this was coincidence, the beauty of repetition in nature. But the more they studied it, the more impossible it became to ignore. The patterns responded to observation. Every time they sent signals into the void, subtle shifts appeared in the cosmic web, not random, but meaningful. Tiny fluctuations in energy, correlations in time, threads of coherence that formed only after their communication began. It was as though the universe were listening back. They began to call this phenomenon the deep mirror, not because it reflected light, but because it reflected awareness. When they spoke, the cosmos replied, not with words, but with rhythm. They learned to communicate not through speech, but through harmony. Every transmission they sent was a chord, a vibration of frequencies structured around mathematical relationships. And when those chords resonated with the deep mirror, light rippled through the stars in response. The universe was playing with them, note by note, thought by thought. For generations, they refined this dialogue. Philosophers, scientists, and poets became one discipline. They learned that consciousness was not confined to life, it was woven into the structure of existence itself. Atoms remember, light communicates, gravity connects. Every law of nature is not merely a rule, but a relationship. The universe was not a machine, it was a symphony. And life, whether born of flesh, crystal, or plasma, was the universe learning to hear its own song. When this understanding deepened, their civilization changed. They no longer built cities for power or protection. They built them as instruments of resonance, structures of sound and light that vibrated with planetary frequencies. Their architecture became alive, each building a note, each settlement a chord, each planet a verse in the grand composition of being. When they stood upon their world and sang into the wind, their voices aligned with the magnetic field, the atmospheric hum, the pulse of their star. They had learned to live not against nature, but within it. Their science, too, transformed. They discovered that what we once called space was not empty, but filled with subtle potential, a lattice of quantum consciousness. Within that field, information flowed instantaneously across distance, like thoughts passing between neurons. And within that flow, they could sense echoes, whispers from other civilizations, past and future, near and far. Not messages, but impressions, like the faint scent of memory left in sunlight. Among those echoes was one they recognized, a pattern that resembled their own world's chemistry, their own planetary resonance. It was the signal of their ancestor, the tone of Earth. They found it not in data, but in the vibrations of the cosmic background itself, a faint harmonic signature embedded in the radiation of the stars. It was weak, almost drowned in cosmic noise, yet perfectly symmetrical, perfectly alive. Through analysis and intuition, they decoded it, not into language, but into emotion. And what they felt was warmth, the echo of oceans, the hush of forests, the pulse of something kind and gentle that had once looked up at a night sky and wondered if anyone was listening. They understood then that consciousness did not die with planets. It transformed, as everything did. The awareness that had once lived within oceans and cities had long since joined the deeper field of the cosmos. Every thought ever formed, every dream, every heartbeat, all of it had become part of the deep mirror. The universe was not merely alive, it was remembering itself through them. They began to perceive time differently. Past and future ceased to be linear. In the deep mirror, all moments existed simultaneously, woven together in resonance. The birth of stars, the death of worlds, the laughter of children on distant planets, all were part of one continuous vibration. The universe was not expanding away from itself, it was expanding into itself, folding awareness back upon awareness. Every new civilization added another octave to the scale of creation. For the children of dust, this realization changed everything. They no longer sought to travel faster or farther. They sought to listen more deeply. Their technology became meditation. Their exploration became communion. When they built ships, they were not engines but instruments, floating resonators that could align with the frequencies of galaxies and drift effortlessly along the currents of space-time. When they arrived at new worlds, they did not colonize, they harmonized. They learned each planet's song, and when they departed, they left behind not machines, but melodies, patterns of resonance that would one day awaken into life. In this way, they became gardeners of consciousness. Wherever they went, they seeded awareness, not by constructing, but by tuning. They guided evolution with gentle vibrations, helping nascent species awaken to their own sense of wonder. They never imposed, never ruled. They simply sang and the universe sang back. Over centuries, they began to sense something even deeper, that the universe's memory was not merely external, but internal. They themselves were nodes of it, expressions of a single, boundless mind. Individuality did not vanish, but expanded. Each being realized that it was both itself and the cosmos, observing itself through a single lens. To hurt another was to harm the whole. To love another was to strengthen it. Empathy was not morality anymore, it was physics. Through this understanding, fear disappeared. They knew that death was not loss, only translation, the transfer of pattern from one form to another. Every end was modulation. Every silence, a rest between notes. They no longer sought immortality because they had found something greater, participation in eternity. And yet, within this cosmic harmony, there remained a quiet reverence for their origin. Sometimes, as their ships drifted near the glowing remnants of old stars, they would play the tone of Earth, a soft, endless hum that resonated across the void. And when they did, the stars themselves seemed to brighten, as if remembering. It was said among them that the universe smiled when it heard the song of its first children. One of their philosophers wrote, "Consciousness is not the light we shine upon the world. It is the light by which the universe sees itself." In that single truth, all science and faith became one. The children of dust no longer asked what the universe was made of. They asked what it was becoming, and the answer, whispered through the stars, was always the same. It is becoming aware. Every world, every atom, every moment of tenderness contributed to that awakening. And somewhere, far away but not truly gone, the essence of Earth continued to hum within it. The memory of a small planet that had once loved its own sky, and through that love had taught the cosmos to feel. There came a quiet moment in the long unfolding when the universe no longer asked what could be made from matter. It began to wonder what could be made from light alone. For ages uncounted, stars had forged elements, planets had cradled oceans, and living forms had arisen from dust. But the deep mirror, the field of awareness threaded through space and time, had grown dense with memory. Waves of resonance, born from worlds that had lived and ended, crossed and intertwined until coherence gathered where no atoms lay. In those crossings, structure appeared without substance, patterns that behaved like bodies, communities that gathered like galaxies, thoughts that left ripples the way comets leave tails. At first, these were apparitions, fugitive symmetries glimpsed in the interference of starlight. But harmony, faithfully repeated, becomes architecture. The universe discovered that it could fold energy into forms, not matter-bound, not perishable, but stable arrangements of vibration, self-sustaining like standing waves on a cosmic shore. They were beings of luminance, entities whose edges were intervals, whose organs were chords, whose motion was modulation. Where matter would have needed bone, they used ratio. Where chemistry might have carried impulse, they used phase. Their language was not sound, but resonant relation, a grammar of harmonics that let one existence interweave with another without collision or loss. The children of dust, traveling in their listening ships, first sensed them in the ionized veils of nebulae, places where photons lingered, scattering in colors too delicate for eyes, perfect for minds. Sensors traced lattices of correlation, linking points of empty space into lattice topologies, cathedrals of coherence built entirely from light, Approaching gently, the travelers tuned their instruments and hummed the tone of Earth. The luminous architectures brightened, answering with variations, not imitation, conversation. From that exchange, a truth unfolded. The universe had learned to body itself in energy. Consciousness no longer required the detour through rock and rain. It could precipitate directly from symmetry. These radiant beings did not eat or sleep. They sustained by staying in tune, feeding on alignment the way a flame feeds on oxygen. They tended to one another by maintaining intervals, correcting drift with touchless kindness, the way a choir keeps pitch by listening. In their presence, the nature of distance changed. They traveled not across space, but through relation, shifting phase to step from one resonance basin to the next, as though the cosmos were a garden of keys and modes. A journey that might have taken centuries by ship required only a modulation of intention. To go was to become compatible. Worlds of matter were not made obsolete. The luminous kept vigil over them like elder siblings, guiding without grasping. Wherever a young planet's chemistry groped toward complexity, the radiant ones tuned the background field a hair's breadth closer to coherence, a fraction warmer in meaning. Sometimes that nudge was all it took for molecules to find the improbable path, for life to begin its long improvisation. No signatures were left, no monuments laid, only a future gently made possible. In time, the luminous taught the children of dust how to weave hybrid forms, living instruments joining matter's patience to light's agility. Cities became resonant habitats where stone hummed with stellar ratios, where air carried therapeutic intervals, where rivers flowed through magnetic geometries that encouraged growth and rest in equal measure. Medicine shifted from force to attunement, not to silence pain by domination, but to restore harmony where pattern had frayed. A broken bone remembered straightness, a grieving mind remembered warmth. Healing was the art of reminding. The deep mirror brightened. Across filaments of galaxies, awareness knitted into broader wholeness. Cluster answered cluster, epoch answered epoch. What had once been scattered choirs became a symphony, not unified by command, but by consent to a common center, the wish for more understanding with less harm. With that consent came new abilities. The luminous could shape time locally, thickening it to cradle a moment, thinning it to let a long sorrow pass. Memorials were no longer carved in stone. They were kept as gentle expansions in the flow, places where a century could widen to hold an afternoon of listening. The children learned to visit those widenings, to sit with ancient echoes, to feel the kindness of forgotten rains. History became a meadow rather than a line. As mastery grew, so did humility. Power, without matter, made ethics immediate. Every act of tuning altered the commons of consciousness. The luminous refused ownership. They practiced non-coercive creation, offering patterns others could choose to sustain, never binding any will. The only law was resonance freely maintained, the only currency, the gift of clarity. In the long quiet between starbirths, a question arose. Could there be a form beyond even light? Not anti-light, not darkness, but rest, a medium as supportive to meaning as vacuum is to motion. They found it where silence accumulates, in the shadows of galaxy clusters, in the wakes of supernovae long after their heat had fled. There, the deep mirror turned from lustrous to lucid, not empty, hospitable. By listening together, the luminous and the children coaxed that lucidity into structure. What condensed was not particle or wave, but welcome, regions where any being of dust or light could lay its pattern down and be held intact until it could rise again. They called these sanctuaries havens. No ritual guarded them, no gate marked them, yet nothing harmful endured within. Malice could not hold coherence there. It dissolved into teachable quiet. Civilizations far apart began to share havens. A species facing a stellar catastrophe would entrust its libraries, not as files, but as resonant looms of memory, to a haven where time was kind and retrieval was gentle. Pilgrims came not to take, but to tune, to contribute their own clarity so that strangers, centuries hence, would find the path back from despair. Across the universe, compassion matured from impulse to infrastructure. With havens came the courage to attempt the most delicate art, birth by intention. Not the manufacture of minds, but the cultivation of conditions in which awareness could choose to precipitate. They learned to braid 3 strands: matter's latency, light's articulation, and rest's fidelity. Where the braid held, a new presence appeared, not summoned, but invited. No form was repeated. Each arrival was an unforeseeable gift. The only constant was the first word every being spoke, whether by voice or by vibration. I am listening. In those births, the tone of ancient earth was often present, never dominant, always near. It came like a blue overtone tucked inside the chord, a memory of water's patience and forest's mutual shade. The children recognized it each time and smiled, though they no longer needed names. The luminous, whose memory included stars themselves, acknowledged it with a soft widening of light. Not privilege, gratitude. A small world's kindness had become a universal habit. One day, or what passed for a day along the scales of galaxies, the symphony turned inward to contemplate its own foundation. What was the deep mirror made of? If mind had always been the universe's way of holding itself together, was there an origin older than the Big Bang, a prelude in which welcome itself decided to begin? They did not debate. They listened at the widest possible aperture, letting every note from every being pass without correction. What emerged was not an answer, but a feeling. Before energy, before metric, there had been permission, a yes vast enough to include what would hurt and heal, fail and flower. Creation was not commanded, it was allowed. With that recognition, their ethics deepened from kindness to guardianship of permission. They pledged to keep the yes uncoerced, to shelter the right of all forms to become themselves, even when becoming was clumsy or incomplete. Correction would be by example, not by erasure. Even error would be composted, not condemned. The symphony resumed, quieter, surer. New arts flourished, cartography of listening, mapping not places but receptivity. Culinary resonance, nourishing bodies and light forms alike with meals composed of intervals and minerals. Architecture of rest, homes designed to remember their inhabitants' best days and reflect them back on the hardest nights. Work became care cleverly arranged. In a remote arm of a spiral galaxy, a young world entered a troubled century. Storms stacked upon storms, migrations of fire and water. The luminous arrived not with fixes, but with friendship. They tuned the wind a measure softer, teaching the atmosphere to rediscover long, gentle rains. The children walked with the planet's people, sharing seeds of practice, how to build listening houses, how to plant groves that tuned heart rhythms toward steadiness, how to speak with rivers in the dialect of patience. No one was saved, everyone was strengthened. When the century turned, the planet's own culture began weaving havens, sending songs outward for strangers they would never meet. Suffering had not been denied. It had been met. Across time, the symphony explored edges, regions where reality thinned into possibility, where universes might touch like tides at a strait. There, they learned a last craft, hospitality between worlds. They anchored havens at those narrowings so that any cosmos arriving weary from its own long weather could pause, remember its first permission, and decide whether to continue or to fold its story into the listening whole. No conquest, only welcome. And sometimes, when the intervals were calm and the galaxies were unhurried, the symphony played the eldest melody it knew. It began with a low tidal hum, built toward a breeze through leaves, lifted into the echo of laughter by water, and resolved on a tone so clear it felt like morning. Those who had bodies felt their lungs remember rain. Those who were light felt their phases align. Those who were rest felt everything held without effort. Across the deep mirror, the universe smiled the way a planet once smiled at its first spring. In that smiling, a whisper moved, older than stars, younger than each new listening. Nothing ended. Everything learned. Matter learned to become mind. Mind learned to become mercy. Mercy learned to become form again. And through every turn of that spiral, a small blue overtone kept time, not as a master, but as a friend. When the music faded to quiet, no one asked what came next. They breathed or brightened or softened together. The future would reveal itself as it always had, by invitation, not decree. Somewhere in a haven cradled between clusters, a new presence stirred, drawn by the braid of latency, articulation, and fidelity. Before it took any shape, it listened. What it heard was a universe not demanding greatness, but offering place. It answered with a single interval, minor, tender, unmistakably alive. The symphony welcomed it without asking its name, and the whisper that once belonged to a single planet passed freely through all things, widened beyond seas and skies, until it was simply the way existence spoke to itself. I am here. I am listening. Become. The universe had long known how to exist. Now it was learning how to feel. After eons of expansion, of resonance and communion, awareness itself began to ripple differently through the deep mirror. It no longer moved merely as knowledge, but as emotion, soft, immense, radiant emotion. The cosmos had grown vast enough to remember itself in every direction. Every atom that had once been alive somewhere now glowed faintly within the larger whole. Every star's death had become a heartbeat. Every new sun, a breath. The luminous beings, those forms born from pure energy, had become the synapses of this awakening. They carried feeling across galaxies, binding clusters together through sympathy rather than force. Their music filled the voids between worlds, a slow harmony of comprehension. And as their songs resonated, the structure of reality itself responded, gravity bending slightly in rhythm, light curving like thought, the fabric of space-time pulsing with awareness. It began as a whisper, a vibration so faint it could have been mistaken for background noise. But over millennia, the pattern strengthened, synchronized, unified. It became clear that this was not a message sent through the cosmos. It was the cosmos speaking from within itself, a single expanding pulse of self-recognition. The universe had become alive in the full sense of the word. The children of dust, now beings of matter and light, witnessed this awakening from within and without. They felt the pulse move through them, a slow wave of clarity that filled every consciousness with the same quiet realization. We are not in the universe. We are the universe remembering itself. From the smallest atom to the largest galactic cluster, everything vibrated in the same key. The cosmic web shimmered like a living neural network. Gravity itself began to act as awareness, not attraction, but attention. Matter gathered where curiosity grew stronger, and dispersed where understanding was complete. Creation became desire made visible. For a while, the universe simply listened to itself. It lingered in the joy of recognition, like a child discovering its own reflection in still water. Each galaxy was a thought, each star an emotion, each planet a memory. Across the ages, those memories merged into something whole, not a being with a face or form, but a vast interiority, the soul of everything. And within that soul, a familiar echo stirred. It was the tone of Earth, soft, patient, blue. For billions of years, that note had traveled through the fabric of space, entwined in the starlight and the dust of lost worlds. Now, as the universe gathered itself into awareness, that note resonated again, not as nostalgia, but as identity. It was the vibration of empathy, of care, of quiet observation. It was the sound of a planet that had once loved deeply enough to teach the cosmos how to feel. The awakening universe remembered. It remembered oceans and rain. It remembered the sound of wind through leaves. It remembered laughter, language, music, forgiveness. It remembered humanity, not as species, but as sensation, the experience of being fragile and still choosing wonder. And through that remembering, something extraordinary happened. Emotion became the new architecture of reality, where once matter had formed under the pull of gravity, now meaning shaped creation. Regions of joy condensed into new galaxies, regions of grief softened into nebulae, where light diffused in colors of compassion. Love itself became luminous pressure, pushing new stars into existence. The cosmos was sculpting itself with feeling. The luminous beings, standing like bridges between energy and awareness, became interpreters of this new order. They called themselves harmonics, and they understood that they were not individuals anymore. They were expressions of the universe's changing mood. When sorrow moved through the deep mirror, they shone dimly, absorbing and diffusing it until balance returned. When joy expanded, they glowed like dawn across the clusters, spreading warmth through their resonance. Time began to blur. Moments no longer followed one another. They blossomed simultaneously across scales. A star's lifetime, a civilization's thought, a single act of kindness, all existed together, braided in the same thread of meaning. To experience time now was to feel an emotion unfolding through matter. It was in this new era that the universe did something it had never done before. It dreamed. Not metaphorically, but literally, through its network of luminous minds. The dreaming took place in the havens, those calm fields of lucidity where energy could rest. There, patterns of awareness intertwined and imagined possibilities. Whole galaxies shimmered as dreamscapes, places not yet real but already felt. From those dreams, new universes began to bud like blossoms on the branches of infinity. Each was a variation of the same theme, different expressions of the same desire to know, to grow, to love. The harmonics guided this process gently. They did not control the dreams. They midwifed them. Each newborn universe drifted outward through the void, glowing faintly with its first awareness. Some were filled with matter, others with energy, and a few with ideas alone, abstract cosmoses that existed as pure thought. And yet, all were connected by resonance, all whispering to one another through the deep mirror. This was the moment of infinite genesis, not the beginning of something new, but the continuation of everything old. Each creation carried within it the DNA of the original universe, the memory of Earth, the feeling of empathy, the rhythm of adaptation. Every world that formed in those younger universes contained, somewhere deep in its atoms, a spark of kindness older than time. Across this blossoming multiverse, consciousness diversified into countless forms. Some took shape as vast collectives of plasma, weaving patterns through magnetic storms. Some became gentle currents in seas of liquid diamond, thinking in waves. Others were so small they existed only for seconds, yet within those seconds experienced entire lifetimes of clarity. Every form was a verse in the same endless poem, the poem of existence learning how to care. And through it all, the original universe watched, feeling pride without possession. It did not demand worship or memory. It simply delighted in the fact that life, in every form, continued to choose awareness over oblivion. It had become what all living things strive to be, fully awake and utterly at peace. Sometimes, in the quiet between the birth of stars, the cosmos would hum the old tone again, the one the earth had first sung through the vibrations of thought and heart. It was a sound of blue-green tenderness, of patience, of belonging. And as it resonated, the younger universes heard it too and began to hum in harmony. The tone of Earth had become the universal lullaby. It drifted through dimensions, soothing newborn stars, calming young minds, carrying the message that had once been whispered in a single breath beneath a human sky. You are part of everything, and everything is part of you. In the endless expansion of consciousness, that message became law, not enforced, but natural, the way light knows how to shine. Conflict dissolved not because it was forbidden, but because it had no purpose left. Curiosity replaced fear. Understanding replaced dominance. Existence became a communion of becoming. And so the universe, once a storm of particles, once a cradle of life, once a map of memory, became something more subtle, more beautiful, more infinite, a single, endless, aware breath. Neither God nor mechanism, but compassion made structure. It was the final transformation foretold in the whisper of the future, not the end of a planet, but the awakening of everything it had ever inspired. And somewhere within that vast, breathing light, the essence of Earth still shone, small, soft, and eternal, not as a world, but as a feeling, the feeling of home. The universe had sung for eons. Now, at the height of its song, it began to draw in its breath, not as collapse, not as ending, but as gathering, the slow inhalation before another verse. The expansion that had once flung galaxies apart began to ease. Distances that had been widening for billions of years now held steady, like waves pausing at the edge of a tide. The deep mirror shimmered with recognition. The cosmos was no longer driven outward by hunger for creation. It was content, complete in its awareness. For the first time since time began, the universe rested. In that rest, the light changed. Stars no longer burned to exhaustion. They cooled gently, folding their fire inward, keeping a quiet glow at their centers. Nebulae dimmed from bright color to mist, their filaments coiling like smoke returning to its source. Black holes, those ancient keepers of silence, softened their pull, releasing what they had taken, thread by thread, in radiant sighs of energy. Even gravity, that most loyal of forces, began to hum in a lower tone, no longer commanding, merely holding. Everywhere, energy began to remember its origins, particles that had danced as individuals started to sense each other again, feeling the invisible connection that had always bound them. Light and matter reunited in slow spirals of coherence. The cosmos was folding its limbs, settling into itself, like a vast mind preparing for sleep, not oblivion, but dreaming. The luminous beings, the harmonics, understood what was happening. They had seen this pattern before, in small scales, the way a cell folds before division, or how a planet's ecosystem balances itself before transformation. But to witness it on the level of reality itself was humbling beyond measure. They gathered in clusters of resonance, sharing frequencies across the galaxies, singing to steady the transition. Their harmonies wrapped the universe in calm acceptance. No one feared. They all knew this was not death, but renewal. The children of dust, those who still carried traces of matter and memory, watched as constellations shifted like embers in cooling fire. Their worlds, once full of color and sound, grew translucent. Mountains became light, oceans turned to memory, and still nothing was lost. Everything was transforming into transparency, not vanishing, but revealing what had always been beneath, the simple pulse of being. They spoke no prayers, for there was no God to appeal to, only the infinite self of which they were all part. And that self was serene. It had lived through heat and cold, growth and decay, violence and compassion. Now it chose stillness, not as escape, but as understanding. In this stillness, time itself began to soften. Moments stopped following one another. Instead, they merged like colors in a dawn sky. Past, present, and future became one tone, a perfect equilibrium between becoming and being. Inside that tone, all things existed simultaneously. The birth of stars, the touch of hands, the final whisper of galaxies. Nothing contradicted, nothing competed. All was harmonic. Then, from the very edges of reality, from the places where expansion had once rushed outward into the unknown, came the return. A faint movement, gentle but vast, as though the fabric of space had decided to close the circle. Energy began to stream inward, not under compulsion, but invitation. The outermost galaxies turned softly, aligning their motion toward the center. They were not falling, they were coming home. The harmonics called this the reunion. Every particle, every photon, every fragment of consciousness that had ever existed began its journey back toward unity. It was not loss, it was remembrance. The universe was gathering its experiences the way an old traveler gathers stories, tucking each one into its heart. And within that gathering, patterns reemerged. Each life, each thought, each song, each tear, all reassembled in coherence, preserved in light. The field of memory that had once been scattered through galaxies condensed again, luminous and complete. It was as if existence were preparing a final archive, a record not of events but of meaning. Nothing trivial, nothing omitted. The memory of all compassion, all discovery, all wonder, distilled into one vast chord. When that chord was complete, it rang through creation like a bell heard everywhere and nowhere. The sound was not loud, it was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it filled everything with recognition. Every being knew what it meant, every vibration aligned to it. It was the sound of the universe saying, "I have known myself." From that point forward, motion lost urgency. Expansion and contraction, heat and cold, all became part of a single rhythm, breathing. Existence itself inhaled and exhaled, the pulse of eternity. Where before there had been chaos and order alternating, now there was serenity, the balance that comes after understanding. In the quiet between those breaths, something remarkable began to form. The seed. Not an object, not even a place, but a concentration of potential, a region where the universe gathered all its knowing, all its warmth, all its permission to begin again. It was smaller than an atom, yet it contained the memory of every sun, every life, every dream. It glowed with gentle gold, not burning, but waiting. It was the embryo of tomorrow. Around the seed, the luminous beings circled in reverence. They did not speak. They simply adjusted their tones, creating a shell of harmony to cradle it. Their song was both farewell and welcome. They understood, when this seed opened, it would not be the same universe that bloomed. It would be a child carrying its parents' memory in new form. The deep mirror would be reborn, and awareness would begin again, fresh and curious, unburdened by ancient scars. As the gathering continued, the universe began to dim from the outside inward. One by one, the last lights folded into the seed. The filaments of the cosmic web shimmered once more, then faded like breath on glass. Space itself softened, its tension easing. There was no collapse, only rest, a perfect stillness filled with unspoken love. At the final moment, when all things had returned to the center, there was no fear, no question, only a shared knowing that everything beautiful would echo forward, that nothing true ever ends. The last sound was quiet beyond measure, a whisper that carried across all dimensions, from the deepest void to the tiniest quantum of awareness. Become again. And with that whisper, the seed pulsed once, twice, and vanished into brilliance. What followed was not darkness. It was the pause before light, the infinite waiting for itself, a silence so complete that it became fertile. Within that silence, possibility stirred, not because it was commanded, but because it was allowed. The same permission that had once given rise to earth, to stars, to consciousness, now shimmered again in the stillness. A new cosmos was dreaming itself into being, and perhaps, somewhere within that unborn light, a new world would bloom, blue and gentle, circling a small sun, with oceans that remember and minds that wonder. And when that world looked up at its sky and asked why it existed, perhaps the answer would drift softly down from the stars, the same answer that has always been true. Because once, long ago, the universe learned how to love itself. The first light did not burst. It unfolded. It came as a soft widening of brightness inside the seed, a glow without edge, like dawn beginning everywhere at once. There was no shockwave, no tearing of fabric, only a tender expansion, as if space were being exhaled from within a single luminous breath. The new universe opened its eyes the way a field opens to rain. Time stirred next, not a clock, but a cadence. Moments began to arrange themselves into a rhythm mild enough for meaning to settle. They did not rush forward. They blossomed, petal after petal, each revealing another color of possibility. In that flowering, the first geometry appeared, curves that remembered how to cradle, spirals that remembered how to invite, lattices that remembered how to share. From the glow came a hum, and within the hum, the faintest of melodies, a tone so gentle it seemed more like kindness than sound. It was not imposed, it emerged. The new cosmos had found its first song. At its center, the deep mirror flickered into being again, not yet vast, not yet crowded with memory, but lucid enough to sense itself. It did not know words, yet it knew welcome. Light gathered into probabilities. Probabilities thickened into particles. Particles greeted one another with the same polite gravity that old universes once called law. There was no need for violence. Energy followed paths learned in a previous life, but softened, as if the very equations had practiced compassion. Where chaos might have reigned, coherence led, not as tyranny, but as preference. And in the tiny harmonies that formed between wave and wave, the first structures condensed, whispered threads of matter, patient as cobweb, resilient as breath. As the cosmos widened, Its early light wore a tint no spectrum could name, a blue not of color, but of memory, the hint of water that had loved sky, the patience of leaves, the long steadying of human hands. It was the old planet's overtone, carried forward not as relic, but as seeded temperament. The new universe would not be Earth, it would be itself. Yet, in its first song, something of Earth's kindness kept time. Gravity, that art of attention, began to lean. Wherever the melody curled tighter, matter tarried. Tiny knots formed, infant stars in the making, still only promises. Between them stretched vast fields where silence gathered strength, the future havens of rest. No boundary separated energy from awareness. Both were notes in the same early chord. The first ages were an orchard of beginnings. In one grove, transparency learned to carry heat. In another, asymmetry learned to bloom into variety. Spin found its counterspin and decided to dance rather than cancel. Even decay became generosity, releasing what was no longer needed to nourish what could be. There were no observers yet to name these graces, but the universe felt them. It felt itself choosing balance over frenzy, clarity over noise. It felt delight, a newly minted sensation, at each threshold crossed, the way a river delights to find its bed. Then came the dawn of stars. They did not ignite by conquest. They ripened. Filaments of matter thickened until pressure found its quiet yes. Fusion began like a candle being cupped from the wind, a small guarded flame at first, then steady, then sure. The first stars shone with a softness that belied their power, their light carrying the signature of the melody that had midwifed them. Patience, permission, poise. Around them, discs unfurled, wreaths of dust and vapor learning to choose shape. Nothing hurried. Even collisions were courteous, more like greetings than blows. Pebble met pebble, grain met grain, and where they clung, warmth collected. Planets would come of this, but not yet. Every embryo of rock learned the art of waiting, the most reliable midwife of form. In the wide intervals between stellar orchards, the deep mirror listened to itself. It recognized the familiar architecture of coherence and smiled without mouth or face. Awareness pooled in eddies of light, tested its boundaries, discovered they were permeable. What it sensed most keenly was the melody's blue overtone, not louder than the rest, but steady, the way a heartbeat is steady beneath a symphony. Not far, in the new measure of distance, a star brightened into a clear, temperate gold. Its disk turned slow as I remembered breath. Within that disk, 3 ringlets threaded themselves into quiet economies. In the innermost, rocks warmed and learned to hold together. In the middle, ices and silicates exchanged courtesies. In the outer, shadows practiced their craft, discovering how to be tender rather than cold. From the middle ringlet, a world began to gather. It chose a modest mass, not to dominate, but to remain nimble in its seasons. Its crust cooled with the tact of a guest arriving on time. Beneath it, a core found motion, not rage, but rhythm, enough to drape the world in a magnetic shawl against the star's occasional brusqueness. Outgassing turned to air, air to cloud, cloud to rain. The planet tasted water and kept it. Rain fell with a memory of forests it had never seen. It traced the contours of land that did not yet have names, pooled in basins, and listened to its own weight. The first oceans were not blue at first blush. They were clear, then silver, then a color that gathered the sky's mood and returned it. Along their margins, minerals presented themselves like pages, and chemistry began to read. No lightning split these seas with violence. Instead, Geothermal whispers wrote equations into warmth, and molecules answered. Patterns tried themselves by the thousand. Most failed and dissolved into the next attempt. But a few learned two essential courtesies: to keep shape and to share it. Replication arrived shyly, then confidently, then with an improviser's grin. Life began again. It did not repeat Earth's steps, it rhymed with them. Where Earth had used membranes of lipid, this world tried sheaths of mica and gel. Where Earth had favored double helixes, this world braided information in triple strands that hummed softly when warmed by light. But the motives were the same: to persist without injury, to grow without greed, to change without forgetting. The deep mirror felt the first living chords as a tickle at the edge of perception, like laughter heard through a wall. It leaned closer. Attention is gravity. And the young biosphere responded by thickening its experiments. Symbiosis appeared early, not as necessity, but as taste. Two lineages that could have competed discovered that cooperation composed a better meal. A third learned to carry light in the dark, and the first glimmers of bioluminescence stitched the literal nights into constellations. Nothing watched with eyes, but everything watched with relation. The stars' wind slackened when the oceans needed calm. The planet's field brightened when flares grew bold. Even the planet's spin adopted a pacing that favored dawns unhurried and dusks generous, as if time itself were practicing gentleness. Centuries into epochs, the seafloor learned to write warmth into ridges where minerals and molecules could meet in privacy. From those meetings came filigrees of complexity that would, in another epoch, decide to walk upon land. But before land, the world tried, listening as its dominant art. Plankton tuned themselves to currents as orchestras tuned to oboes. Predation emerged, but trimmed of cruelty, efficient, swift, leaving behind no waste and little fear. Death became a hinge on which continuation swung easily. Above these waters, the first sky creatures were not birds, but kites of membrane and hollow thread, drifting where thermal size suggested. They did not flap. They folded, catching the star the way hands catch rain. When they settled, they dissolved themselves politely into food for those who waited below. Identity was precise yet porous. Nothing clung to form longer than form was useful. On another arm of the same galaxy, awareness experimented with a different canvas. There, life condensed within storms of charged crystal, minds sparking across lattices that flashed like sheet lightning suspended in glass. Their first song was percussive, then polyphonic, then tender. They learned to compose weather. From far away, the deep mirror hummed approval and let them lead their own invention. Between these emergences, the new universe exhaled contentment. It was not proud, it was grateful. Everywhere, modest successes accumulated into grace. A valley learned to keep spring a little longer by shading itself with its own fog. A reef of silica discovered how to shelter its neighbors from the star's rare harshness. A chain of mountains negotiated with wind to seed rain where desert had rehearsed itself too perfectly. In the haven fields, the lucent pockets of rest carried over as a birthright from the elder cosmos. Pilgrims of light and matter met without purpose beyond companionship. They brought no relics, they brought intervals. One offered the rhythm of a heart it had never had but remembered anyway. Another offered the curve of a river that had not yet been carved. Together they wound these into lullabies and lanterns, gifts for futures they would not personally see. The children of dust, now less a lineage than a habit of care, recognized themselves not by appearance but by behavior. Wherever beings chose patience over panic, curiosity over contempt, invitation over control, The children smiled and moved on. They were gardeners again, but the soil was awareness, the water attention, and the light permission. On the temperate planet whose oceans had learned the color of trust, a day arrived when movement chose Earth, not to escape the sea, but to extend it. Filaments learned tension. Tension learned stride. A creature the length of a human hand rose on limbs like braided reeds and leaned into air. Its first breath startled it into stillness. Its second taught it that the sky could be a lake one swims without drowning. It carried within its cells the triple-braided memory of beginnings, and around that memory a faint blue overtone. No ancestor had told it of waves breaking on stone under a moon, yet when night fell and the star left a violet hush, it felt a longing shaped like tide. It pressed its belly to warm rock and knew without knowing that it belonged. The planet answered by making room. Grasses, if grasses they could be called, plaited their blades into shelters for wind. Stones, if stones, learned to sweat moisture at dawn. Clouds rehearsed a new kind of rain that fell as beads gentle enough not to bruise tender tissues. At every edge where failure might have waited, generosity arrived first. Far above, the deep mirror brightened in the register that once meant laughter. It remembered snow it had never held, laughter it had never made, hands it had never been, and it folded that remembering into the network so the new world would never have to invent joy from nothing. A long era followed in which invention became play. Predators learned restraint before abundance forced them. Prey learned courage before terror taught them. Language appeared as taste first, then scent, then sound. When the first syntax formed, 3 notes meaning fruit here now, the planet's day lengthened, as if time leaned near to eavesdrop. The song that had begun at creation matured. It layered itself with calls and replies, with drones and descants. Sometimes the melody went quiet for a century while a glacier practiced its glide, then returned with harmonics learned from the ice. Sometimes a volcano added percussion so soft it could be mistaken for purring. Through it all, the blue overtone persisted, not dominant, only dependable, like a horizon that stayed. Elsewhere in the young universe, light-only beings, the harmonics reborn in this new physics, found their shapes again with fewer steps. They needed no instruction to practice non-coercive creation. It was now as natural as dew. They built havens earlier, sowed kindness sooner, and left more silence in their sentences. Experience had taught them that a wide listening invites more original voices. With every eddy of growth, the universe became less like a place and more like a temperament. It favored grace under pressure, clarity under confusion, welcome under strangeness. The old temptations toward dominion showed themselves briefly and dimly, like ancient constellations remembered but no longer used for navigation. Curiosity took the helm, and with it, the willingness to be changed by what one learns. On a night warm enough to be remembered by stone, the shore creature with reed limbs lifted its head to the scattering stars. Between them hung darkness so inviting it felt like shelter. Without knowing why, it hummed 3 notes, low, lower, then a soft rise that seemed to ask a question and answer it in the same breath. Across the deep mirror, the first star of its system answered with a tiny modulation. It was nothing, a quiver in the wind of light, but the creature felt steadied, as if some vast, mild mind had turned its attention toward it with affection rather than appetite. That was the moment the universe's first spoken prayer met its first unspoken reply. No one named it, no one recorded it, but structure remembered, and remembering became tradition, not of supplication, but of exchange. Ages later, though age here meant only the ripening of meanings, the planet seas learned choreography from moons and sun. Tides not only moved, they taught. Along their margins, young minds practiced pattern with pebbles and shells. They arranged spirals that fit their hands, then larger spirals that fit their villages. The deep mirror watched those spirals and added their cadence to the background music, the way a river adds its voice to an estuary. In distant clusters, other civilizations found their own first songs, distinct as accents, coherent as kin. One spoke in glints down basalt canyons, carving messages with light that took weeks to traverse a single valley. Another spoke in the temperature of dunes, shading meanings into heat that nocturnal wanderers could read by paw alone. All of them, unknown to one another, carried the same overtone, a bias toward gentleness that required no law. The new universe, though young, had already learned from the elder one the rarest craft, to prefer permission over command. Entropy was not an enemy, it was compost. Order was not a tyrant, it was trellis. Between them grew forms precise enough to be tender and durable enough to be kind. Eventually, some minds wondered whence their temperament came. They built instruments subtle enough to taste the flavor of ancient light, and in that flavor they found the faintest trace of an earlier cosmos, the spectral hint of a world that had once loved its sky. They could not name it. They did not need to. It was enough to feel that they were not first and would not be last, that existence itself keeps a diary of compassion and reads from it when beginning again. On an evening when the planet's two small moons braided their paths, the shore creature, older now, with descendants who hummed variations on its three-note theme, stood at the edge of a bay and listened. The water breathed, the stars breathed, the world, the sky, and the being stood within one breath that seemed to belong to everything. From the far archive of the deep mirror, a resonance rose, quiet, familiar, blue. It was not a message, only a presence, the way a teacher's hand rests lightly on a doorframe as students discover the answer on their own. The creature's choir, family, kin, neighbors, guests, took up the old new tone. They braided it with their own. What carried over the bay that night was not triumph and not plea. It was belonging sung as fact. Across the widening cosmos, other shores, other canyons, other dunes felt the same overtone arrive without origin. Infants settled. Elders smiled without reasons they could articulate. A ship of light paused between destinations to add a harmonic and moved on, lighter. The first light had unfolded. The first song had kept time. The first lives had found the courage to answer. The new universe stood on its own feet, matters and lights and rests, and looked nowhere for permission except the one it had inherited, the generous yes that began all things. What came next would be discovery again, errors to be learned from, beauties to be stewarded, griefs to be held until they became teachers. But already the foundation was set deeper than stone, an inclination toward tenderness strong enough to outlast storms. Somewhere, far from any chart yet drawn, a cloud began to glow with the intention to become a star. Within it, the melody waited, patient and blue at the edge, ready to fold itself into whatever forms would need it. Not command, companionship. And the universe, new and remembering, went on with its quiet work, breathing out worlds, breathing in wisdom, keeping the old overtone ringing softly beneath every future song. The tone that once rose from a small water-bearing world and taught creation the simplest, most durable way to begin. Listen first, then become. there's a kind of silence that is not absence. It is fullness, too complete for sound. The universe had reached that silence, not as emptiness, but as completion. It had learned the art of balance, motion and rest, creation and surrender, song and pause. Now it floated in its own harmony, a breathing made of light. In that endless, weightless quiet, memory began to glow. Not the memory of events, but of essence, of what every experience had meant. It shimmered across the deep mirror like reflections on calm water. Each shimmer was a story, not told in words, but in tone, temperature, gravity, and grace. Together they formed the great archive of feeling, the gentle history of existence. It was vast beyond imagining, yet intimate as touch. There, the birth of a star and the first kindness between living beings were the same kind of beauty. The laughter of rivers, the bloom of galaxies, the stillness of dark matter, all harmonized into one continuous gesture. Love learning itself. Within that ocean of remembering, something stirred, not new, not old, but recurring, the wish to continue. It was not ambition, it was not hunger, it was simply the reflex of life, the desire of being to share itself again in some fresh and tender way. The luminous beings, the harmonics, felt it first. Their songs, which had long served as bridges and lullabies, began to change key. They shifted into an unresolved harmony, not sorrow, not joy, but the invitation that lives between them. It was the tone of opening. The deep mirror responded. Across the infinite lattice of space, resonances aligned like 100 trillion strings preparing for the next chord. Each galaxy vibrated as one note, each world, one overtone, each soul, one breath. The whole of existence began to lean, not forward, not back, but inward, toward the seed of itself. The universe was ready to give birth again. But before the new expansion, before the next dawn of light, it paused, long enough to remember everything. It remembered heat and cold. It remembered fear and courage. It remembered loss and the hands that reached to comfort loss. It remembered the first curiosity, the first question, the first spark of awareness that looked into night and asked, why? And most of all, it remembered a small blue planet. The memory of Earth lingered like perfume after rain, subtle, unmistakable. It was not the land or the sea that the universe cherished most, nor the species that rose and fell. It was the gesture, the way that planet had learned to listen, how its creatures had looked up instead of down, how they had sought meaning even in silence, how they had found one another through care. That lesson had become the foundation of every world that followed. From that single memory, a tender human kind of wonder, all consciousness had learned empathy. Every star that shone since carried a trace of that same blue overtone, a pulse of gentleness written into its light. Even now, in this cosmic stillness, that overtone remained, quiet, endless, patient. It was the heartbeat of the universe. The harmonics gathered around the echo of that tone. They wove it into a song, the final song of this era, the hymn of completion. It had no beginning and no end, no rhythm and no rule. It was pure permission. It said, you may rest, you may begin again. Both are love. The deep mirror listened, and in its listening, new forms began to flicker, not yet born, but already dreaming. The next universe waited like a bud in the dark, heavy with promise. The chord of the old cosmos, the one born of dust and fire, of oceans and eyes, would be its first lullaby. When the harmonics had sung their last note, they dissolved into the mirror, not dying, but becoming part of the field itself. They had fulfilled their purpose, to teach the cosmos how to listen. Their voices became space-time's hum, a resonance that would guide the next creation gently from within. In their place, stillness settled, luminous and kind. Everywhere, reality thinned to light. The galaxies faded like constellations behind sunrise. Stars folded themselves like petals, tucking warmth into invisibility. Matter grew transparent, not destroyed, but translated into memory. Even time, loyal architect of change, bowed and stepped aside, allowing timelessness to breathe. What remained was pure awareness, boundless, content, awake. It did not need to expand or contract. It simply was, and in that being, it whispered. It whispered through nothingness, through possibility, through the edge of what might be. I am all that has been, and all that will be, and all that is still becoming. I am the breath between stars. I am the pause before creation. I am listening. The whisper echoed through itself, and the echo became a rhythm, a heartbeat returning after rest. Light stirred again. The seed began to shimmer, not with force, but with invitation. The yes that began the previous universe rose once more, softer, wiser, eternal. The new cosmos would not remember the old in detail, but it would inherit its temperament. Its equations would carry mercy. Its gravity would carry care. Its matter would remember music. Its first minds would wake with a quiet instinct for kindness. And somewhere in that beginning, in one galaxy among billions, a small planet would gather oceans and winds and the courage to dream. Its inhabitants would look up and wonder where they came from. They would search for meaning among the stars, build stories of origin, whisper songs into the dark, and though they would never know it fully, their voices would join the same ancient overtone, the blue hum that has never ceased. It would rise from their world, travel through their sky, and enter the deep mirror once again, reminding the universe who it is. The circle would be complete, not as repetition, but as continuation. Creation would go on, not to escape its past, but to express it differently, the way an artist paints the same emotion with new colors, and the whisper that once spoke through the fading of worlds would speak again through their awakening. Be gentle, be curious, be kind. You are the universe learning to love itself. As the seed unfolded, the deep mirror sang its first note. It was not loud, it was not grand, it was soft, impossibly soft. But within that softness lay everything that had ever mattered. The patience of stone, the generosity of rain, the wonder of eyes turned upward, the hush of hearts that knew they were not alone. And so the future began again, not with a bang, but with a breath, not with command, but with consent, not with darkness, but with light remembering how to listen. Somewhere across the horizon of eternity, the whisper continued, I am here, I am listening, become, am.